meaning. Fervent patriotism, as well as religious and revolutionary enthusiasm, often serves as a refuge from guilty conscience. It is a strange thing that both the injurer and the injured, the sinner and he who is sinned against, should find in the mass movement an escape from blemished life. Remorse and a sense of grievance seem to drive people in the same direction. It sometimes seems that mass movements are custom-made to fit the needs of the criminal, not only for the catharsis of his soul, but also for the exercise of his inclinations and talents. The technique of a proselytizing mass movement aims to evoke the faithful the mood and frame of mind of a repentant criminal. Self-surrender, which is, as will be shown in Part 3, the source of a mass movement's unity and vigor, is a sacrifice and act of atonement, and clearly no atonement is called for unless there is a poignant sense of sin. Here as elsewhere, the technique of a mass movement aims to infect people with a melody and then offer the movement as a cure. What a task confronts the American clergy, laments an American divine, preaching the good news of a Savior to the people who, for the most part, have no real sense of sin. An effective mass movement cultivates the idea of sin. It depicts the autonomous self not only as barren and helpless, but also as vile. To confess and repent is to slough off one's individual distinctiveness and separateness, and salvation is found by losing oneself in the holy oneness of the congregation. There is a tender spot for the criminal, and an ardent wooing of him in all mass movements. St. Bernard, the moving spirit of the Second Crusade, thus appealed for recruits. For what is it but an exquisite and priceless chance of salvation due to God alone, that the Omnipotent should deign to summon his service, as through they were innocent murderers, ravishers, adulterers, perjurers, and those guilty of every crime? Revolutionary Russia, too, has a tender spot for the common criminal. Though it is ruthless with the heretic, the ideological deviationist, it is perhaps true that the criminal who embraces a holy cause is more ready to risk his life and go to extremes in his defense than people who are awed by the sanctity of life and property. Crime is to some extent a substitute for a mass movement, where public opinion and law enforcement are not too stringent and poverty not absolute. The underground pressure of malcontents and misfits often leaks out in crime. It has been observed that in the exaltation of mass movements, whether patriotic, religious, or revolutionary, common crime declines. Part 3. United Action and Self-Sacrifice. The vigor of a mass movement stems from the propensity in its followers for united action and self-sacrifice. When we ascribe to the success of a mass movement, to its faith, doctrine, propaganda, leadership, ruthlessness, and so on, we are but referring to instruments of unification and to means used to inoculate a readiness for self-sacrifice. It is perhaps impossible to understand the nature of mass movements unless it is recognized that their chief preoccupation is to foster, perfect, and perpetrate a facility for united action and self-sacrifice. To know the process by which such a facility is engendered is to grasp the inner logic of most of the characteristic attitudes and practices of an active mass movement. With few exceptions, any group or organization which tries, for one reason or another, to create and maintain compact unity and a constant readiness for self-sacrifice usually manifests the peculiarities, both noble and base, of a mass movement. On the other hand, a mass movement is bound to lose much which distinguishes it from other types of organizations when it relaxes its collective compactness and begins to counter self-interest as a legitimate motive of activity. In times of peace and prosperity, a democratic nation is an industrialized association of more or less free individuals. On the other hand, in time of crisis, when the nation's existence is threatened and it tries to reinforce its unity and generate in its people readiness for self-sacrifice, it almost always assumes in some degree the character of a mass movement. The same is true of religious and revolutionary organizations. Whether or not they develop into mass movements depends less on the doctrine they preach and the program they project than on the degree of their preoccupation with unity and the readiness for self-sacrifice. The important point is that the poignantly frustrated the propensities for united action and self-sacrifice arise spontaneously. It should be possible, therefore, to gain some clues concerning the nature of these propensities, and the technique to be employed for their deliberate inoculation by tracing their spontaneous emergence in the frustrated mind. What ails the frustrated? Is it the consciousness of an irredeemably blemished self, their chief desire to escape that self, and it is the desire which manifests itself in a propensity for united action and self-sacrifice? The revulsion from an unwanted self, and the impulse to forget it, masks it, slough it off, and lose it, produce both a readiness to sacrifice itself and a willingness to dissolve it by losing one's individual distinctiveness in a compact collective whole. Moreover, the estrangement from the self was usually accompanied by a train of diverse and seemingly unrelated attitudes and impulses, which a closer probing reveals to be essential factors in the process of unification and the self-sacrifice. In other words, frustration not only gives rise to the desire for unity and the readiness for self-sacrifice, but also creates a mechanism for their realization. Such diverse phenomena as the desperation of the present, a facility for make-believe, a a proneness to hate, a readiness to imitate, credulity, a readiness to attempt the impossible, and many others which crowd the minds of the intensely frustrated, are, as we shall see, unifying agents and prompters of recklessness. In Section 44, Tac 103, an attempt will be made to show that when we set out to inoculate in people a facility for united action and self-sacrifice, we do all we can, whether we know it or not, to induce and encourage an estrangement from the self, and that we strive to evoke and cultivate in them many of the diverse attitudes and impulses which accompany this spontaneous estrangement from the self in the frustrated. In short, we shall try to show that the technique of an active mass movement consists basically in the inoculation and cultivation of proclivities and responses indigenous to the frustrated mind. The reader is expected to quarrel with much of what is said in this part of the book. He is likely to feel that much has been exaggerated, much ignored. But this is not an authoritative textbook. It is a book of thoughts, and it does not shy away from the half-truth so long as they seem to hint at a new approach and help to formulate new questions. To illustrate a principle, says Baggett, you must exaggerate much and you must omit much. The capacities for united action and self-sacrifice seem almost always to go together. When we hear of a group that is particularly contemptuous of death, we are usually justified in concluding that the group is closely knit and thoroughly unified. On the other hand, when we face a member of a compact group, we are likely to find him contemptuous of death. Both united action and self-sacrifice require self-diminution, D-I-M-I-N-U-T-I-O-N. Diminution. In order to become part of a compact whole, the individual has to forego much. He has to give up privacy, individual judgment, and often individual possessions. To school a person to united action is, therefore, to ready him for acts of self-denial. On the other hand, the man who practices self-abnegation sloughs off the hard shell which keeps him apart from others and is thus made assimilable. Every unifying agent is, therefore, a prompter of self-sacrifice and vice versa. Nevertheless, in the following section, the division is made for the sake of convenience, but the dual function of each factor is always kept in mind. It is well to outline here the plan followed in Section 44, Tac 63, which deal with the subject of self-sacrifice. The technique of fostering a readiness to fight and to die consists in separating the individual from his flesh and blood self. It is not allowing it to be his real self. This can be achieved by the thorough assimilation of the individual into a compact collective body, Section 44, Tac 46, by endowing him with the imaginary self, make-believe, Section 47, by implanting him with a deprecating attitude toward the present and reverting his interest on things that are not yet, Sections 48 and 55, by interposing a fact-proof screen between him and reality, doctrine, Sections 56 and 59, by preventing through an injection of passions, the establishment of a stable equilibrium between the individual and his self, fanaticism, Sections 60 and 63. Factors promoting self-sacrifice. Identification with a collective whole. 44. To ripen a person for self-sacrifice, he must be stripped of his individual identity and distinctness. He must cease to be George, Hans, Ivan, or Tadao, a human atom with an existence bounded by birth and death. The most drastic way to achieve this end is by complete assimilation of the individual into a collective body. The fully assimilated individual does not see himself and others as human beings. When asked who he is, his atomic response is that he is a German, a Russian, a Japanese, a Christian, a Muslim, a member of a certain tribe or family. He has no purpose, worth, and destiny apart from his collective body, and as long as the body lives, he cannot really die. To a man utterly without a sense of belonging, mere life is all that matters. It is the only reality in an eternity of nothingness, and he clings to it with shameless despair. Dostoevsky gave words to this state of mind in Crime and Punishment, Part 2, Chapter 4. The student Raskolnikov wanders about R-A-S-K-O-L-N-I-K-O-V, wanders about the streets of St. Petersburg in a delirious state. He had several days ago murdered 2 old women with an axe. He feels cut off from mankind. As he passes through the red light district near the Haymarket, he muses, if one had to live on some high rock, on such a narrow ledge that he'd only room to stand, and the ocean, everlasting darkness, everlasting solitude, everlasting tempest around him, if he had to remain standing on a square yard of space all his life, 1,000 years eternity, it were better to live so than to die at once, only to live and live, life, whatever it may be. The effacement of individual separateness must be thorough. In every act, however trivial, the individual must by same ritual associate himself with the congregation, the tribe, the party, etc. His joys and sorrows, his pride and confidence must spring from the fortunes and capacities of the group, rather than from his individual prospects and abilities. Above all, he must never feel alone. Though stranded on a desert island, he must still feel that he is under the eyes of the group. To be cast out from the group should be equivalent to being cut off from life. This, undoubtedly, a primitive state of being, and its most perfect examples are found among primitive tribes. Mass movements strive to exasperate approximate this primitive perfection, and we are not imagining things when the anti-individualist bias of contemporary mass movement strikes us as a throwback to the primitive. 45. The capacity to resist coercion stems partially from the individual's identification with a group. The people who stood up best in the Nazi concentration camps were those who felt themselves members of a compact party, the communists, of a church, priests and ministers, or a close-knit national group. The individualist, whatever their nationality, caved in. The Western European Jew proved to be the most defenseless. Spurned by the Gentiles, even those within the concentration camps, and without vital ties with the Jewish community, he faced his tormentors alone, forsaken by the whole of humanity. One realizes now that the ghetto of the Middle Ages was for the Jews more a fortress than a prison. Without the sense of utmost unity and distinctness which the ghetto imposed upon them, they could not have endured the unbroken spirit of violence and abuse of those dark centuries. When the Middle Ages returned for a brief decade in our day, they caught the Jew without his ancient defenses and crushed him. The unavoidable conclusion seems to be that when the individual faces torture or annihilation, he cannot rely on the resources of his own individuality. His only source of strength is not being himself, but part of something mighty, glorious, and indestructible. Faith there is primarily a process of identification, the process by which the individual ceases to be himself and becomes part of something eternal. Faith in humanity, in posterity, and the destiny of one's religion, nation, race, part, or family. What is it but the visualization of that eternal something to which we attach the self that is about to be annihilated? It is somewhat terrifying to realize that the totalitarian leaders of our day, in recognizing this source of desperate courage, made use of it not only to steal the spirit of their followers, but also to break the spirit of their opponents. In his purges of the old Bolshevik leaders, Stalin succeeded in turning proud and brave men into cringing cowards by depriving them of any possibility of identification with the party they had served all their lives, and with the Russian masses. These old Bolsheviks had long ago cut themselves off from humanity outside Russia. They had an unbounded contempt for the past and for history, which could still be made by capitalistic humanity. They had renounced God. There was for them neither past nor future, neither memory nor glory outside the confines of Holy Russia and the Communist Party, and both of these were now wholly and irrecoverably in Stalin's hands. They felt themselves, in the words of Bukharin, isolated from everything that constitutes the essence of life. So they confessed. By humbling themselves before the congregation of the faithful, they broke out of their isolation. They renewed their communion with the eternal whole by reveling the self, accusing it of monstrous and spectacular crimes, and sloughing it off in public. The same Russians who cringed and crawled before Stalin's secret police displayed unsurpassed courage when facing singly or in a group the invading Nazis. The reason for this contrasting behavior is not that Stalin's police are more ruthless than Hitler's armies, but that when facing Stalin's police, the Russian feels a mere individual, while facing the Germans he saw himself as a member of a mighty race, possessed of a glorious past and even more glorious future. Similarly, in the case of the Jews, their behavior in Palestine could not have been predicted from their behavior in Europe. The British colonial officials in Palestine followed a policy sound in logic but lacking in insight. The reason that since Hitler had managed to exterminate 6 million Jews without meeting a serious resistance, it should not be too difficult to handle the 600,000 Jews in Palestine. Yet they found that the Jews in Palestine, however recently arrived, were a formidable enemy, reckless, stubborn, and resourceful. The Jew in Europe faced his enemies alone, an isolated individual, a speck of life floating in an eternity of nothingness. In Palestine he felt himself not a human atom, but a member of an eternal race with an interminable past behind it and a breathing future ahead. Number 46. The theoreticians in the Kremlin are probably aware that in order to maintain the submissiveness of the Russian masses, there must not be the least chance of an identification with any collective body outside Russia. The purpose of the Iron Curtain is perhaps more to prevent the Russian people from reaching out, even in thought, towards an outside world than to prevent the infiltration of spies and saboteurs. The curtain is both physical and psychological. The complete elimination of any chance of immigration, even of Russian citizens married to foreigners, blurs the awareness of outside humanity in Russian minds. One might as well dream in hope of escaping to another planet. The psychological barrier is equally important. The Kremlin's brazen propaganda strives to impress upon the Russians that there is nothing worthy and eternal, nothing deserving of admiration and reverence, nothing worth identifying oneself with outside the confines of Holy Russia. Number 47. Make-believe. Dying and killing seem easy when they are part of a ritual, ceremonial, dramatic performance, or game. There is need for some kind of make-believe in order to face death unflinchingly. To our real naked selves there is not a thing on earth or in heaven worth dying for. It is only when we see ourselves as actors in a staged and therefore unreal performance that death loses its frightfulness and finality and becomes an act of make-believe and theatrical gesture.